Did any of the fiction you read growing up, you mentioned Leon Uris, for example, influence your service in any way?
No, no, God knows. I look. I did not. I'm an Iowan. I was drafted. I went. It was my citizen's duty, and I protested. I hadn't really protested the Vietnam War before I was drafted, but afterwards I was marching with my sport coat because we weren't allowed to wear our uniforms, with little GIs for peace signs. And the Vietnam War, I knew before I got there, was a horrible, horrible mistake. And after I got there, I knew a lot more, and it didn't change my opinion. I actually did extremely well in basic training. We had a really smart cadre in my particular basic training unit. At the time, they gave out they gave out 13 E2s to the graduating class in a basic training company. And basically those went to people who had some rank at the end of the period. What they normally did was give people who had college the first slot as platoon leader and squad leaders, and then they were always busted out. My cadre did not give me or a squad mate, Mike Glass, who was in the physics. He was a physics PhD student at the University of Chicago. It was an interesting time. They did not give either of us any rank. We at no point were made squad leaders, and we could not have handled that job at all. Well, we did both get our E2 stripes after basic because we had been damned good soldiers, even if we weren't capable of, leading anything. We were self-starters, and I look back on that, and those guys were really smart. They were amazingly smart in not putting me in a position that I knew as well as they apparently did that I would have failed, but nonetheless not making my life hard because I was in the middle of law school at a prestigious university. But no, it did not. I simply went where the Army sent me. I was enormously lucky in that where the Army sent me in Nam was the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, Black Horse, which I'll get an argument when I say it was the finest unit in Vietnam, but nobody will say that I don't have an argument on my side. And I was extremely lucky to be sent to a group of people who didn't have any more belief in the war or the president or, God knows, the Army brass than I did. But everybody did his job, and he did it as well as he could, and you always knew the guy beside you was going to pull his weight. The difference between my military fiction and that of, say, Joe Haldeman, who had a very similar background going in but was dumped into the 4th Infantry, which, for those of you who weren't around in the 60s, it wasn't quite as bad as the Americal, but believe me, they still sucked hind tit. The best people were not sent to the 4th Infantry. And the difference of the attitude of soldiers to the folks they're serving with in my books because everybody trusts everybody else. You may hate them, but you trust the people you're with. In Joe's, nobody, you can't trust anybody above you, below you, beside you. They'll abandon you. No, not in the Black Horse. But that was good luck. That had nothing to do with anything. That was good luck.
All right. How did you get started writing military science fiction?
Well, that is funny. That is a funny question. I started writing fantasy for August Derleth of Arkham House, because he was the guy who published Conan and published Lovecraft and this sort of thing. And I sold him a short story while I was an undergraduate, and I sold him another short story when I was in law school. But these were historical fantasy. Remember, my background is history and Latin, and I was in law school at the time. But, you know, my background gave me some exotic knowledge and settings, and so that's where I was setting these fantasies. And I wrote a couple more similar things for Mr. Derleth while I was in the Army and immediately after I got back. And then he died, which left me the problem of finding another outlet. And so I tried these historical fantasies on the existing outlets, and they didn't sell. I got nice rejection slips, but that just isn't what was selling. And I had a couple of friends in Chapel Hill by now. Manly Wade Wellman, a longtime science fiction writer, and Carl Wagner, who was starting out also and writing fantasy. And they suggested that I use what I knew about Vietnam as a background. So I did that on a couple of stories, and I immediately sold them. But this was simply using Vietnam as a background for standard fantasies or science fiction. And it was a vividly realized background, rather too much jargon. I mean, an acquaintance at the time said, you write as though everybody'd been to Vietnam. Well, actually, I probably in my head kind of thought that. Understand, I wasn't real tightly wrapped when I got back. I served my 2 years, and I had my one tour of Vietnam and Cambodia. I was part of the legal invasion. I mean, we weren't going in black helicopters. We were going in on the back of M48 tanks. But there was a period that I'd actually spent twice as long in Cambodia as I had in Vietnam. Strange time. But as I say, I was kind of screwed up. But I then got a bright idea. Rather than just write a standard fantasy story or a standard SF story that happened to be set in Vietnam, I would use what I knew of Vietnam and war and an armored unit, and I would create a real science fiction series rather than something set in, you know, the present. But I would have it realistic because it's going to be based on the Black Horse. You know, 11th Armored Cavalry with ray guns. So, and this was just an obvious seller. Boy, was I wrong. Nobody'd touch him. Nobody would touch him. The only outlet was Analog under Ben Bova, who liked me and had bought stories from me and would buy other stories from me. But his comment on the Hammer stories was, well, we've got Jerry Pournelle and Joe Haldeman doing the same thing. I don't think I need 3 of them. Which gives you a notion of how new what we now think of as military SF was in 1972. And the editor of Galaxy was fired, and his assistant was given the job. Actually, I think he was fired because his assistant was so obviously much better than he was, and probably cheaper too. And that was Jim Bain. And he immediately called agents and got back stories that his boss, the incompetent Eiler Jacobson, had rejected, that he had recommended and Eiler Jacobson had rejected. I think, and the first two Hammer stories were in that category. And I thanked Jim for that years later, and he said, "Oh, David, Jake rejected much better stories than yours."